Welcome to another episode of Four Guys Talking About AI. I'm here with my good friends, Greg Sterling, John Gerard, and Neil Polachek. Today, we're going to talk about a bunch of things. John's got a few ideas and ran a few experiments with Claude this week, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I did too, so I want to riff on that a bit. And we'll talk about Search GPT that was just released this week, and how Google's market share hasn't eroded with their quarterly report that came out this week. There's a whole bunch of business applications that we'll talk about with Notebook LM and so forth. Let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about notes from the field. I love these practical applications of how people are using AI innovatively. John, tell us a little bit about what your experiments were this week.
I wanted to actually start with a book by a guy named Ethan Mollick called Co-Intelligence, Living and Working with AI. This was one of my self-appointed homework tasks this last couple of weeks. It's getting a lot of buzz, and it's really a fantastic kind of a primer for somebody who is thinking about how they might want to think about AI and incorporate it into their work life. He's got 4 fantastic principles. Now, you should read the book, so don't just listen to the principles and think this is enough. But I'm going to run through these principles just real quickly so we kind of all have them in mind. I think that they're fantastic. The first one is always invite AI to the table, which is great. So no matter what it is that you're doing that you've typically done without AI, try doing it with AI. The second is you should be the human in the loop. This is an exciting one too, because we know that if you just send AI off to do its own thing and don't pay attention to it and aren't sort of guiding it, checking for hallucinations, you can run into issues. So always be the human in the loop. The third one, which I love and is very practical, is treat AI like a person and tell it what kind of person it is. So we actually know, having experimented with this stuff, that you will get very different answers to a question about, for instance, a medical condition. If you say, hey, you're a 6th grade teacher trying to explain a complex topic to 6th graders versus you are a 30-year physician, top of your field, explaining this disease or condition to a medical school audience. So tell the AI who they are, and that will really change the answers. Now, this last one, and I think you guys will like this, principle number 4, that kind of we know but is really easy to forget, is to assume that this current AI where we are today is the worst that you will ever use. Meaning, whatever you think is happening right now that's blowing your mind, buckle up, because it's going to be even crazier in the coming days, weeks, months, and years. And we see this over and over and over, and it's still hard to get our heads around how quickly this stuff is changing. So assume this AI that you're currently using is the worst that you'll ever use. So those are the 4. I think they're great, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about them.
I think a lot about, could I do this differently with a little help here? I did it yesterday. Greg and I were trying to build an index off of our data because we want to roll out an index. I put in, I said, hey, here are the 5 questions we want to build an index off of. If it told me how to build the index, it gave me the inputs, it gave me the outputs. It was, and then we tweaked it. We were the human in the room. We decided what inputs we really wanted. We decided how to weight it, but it gave me a starting point. And I wasn't sure how I was going to build that index till I put it into ChatGPT. It was brilliant, frankly.
Have you guys tried creating a GPT? Have you done this yet?
Yeah.
I tried in the very beginning, but not since that time.
So I've been doing that lately with different business units that we have, and it is remarkable the kind of results that you can get from this. So for example, load up sales materials, any kind of emails that you've written, any conversations that you've had with people that are germane to what the business is, where you're explaining what you do, any kind of educational materials where you're going to train it up. Just, John, like you said, treat it like an employee, right? And when you treat it like an employee like this, and then you talk to it like an employee. So you load all that stuff up, and you're telling it that you're loading it up so that you're giving it new information. I'm training you right now, and let it know that you're training it. Upload all that stuff, and then ask it if it's got that information. Ask it a few questions back. Tell me a little bit about what I just told you, and riff on that a little bit and fine tune it. Once you have that, it becomes this really amazing resource that you can query again and again and use it like it's your assistant. So if you need to draft up an email really quickly, or you know that you've said these things before, you just don't want to write that all again, you can just query it and it'll return back to you really useful information that you don't have to just rewrite again. Saves you a lot of time, and oftentimes it writes it better than you would write it a second, third, or fourth time.
Yeah, that raises a couple of questions that we'll talk about later in the program around CRM tools and things like that. The sort of disruption of existing software, legacy software applications with a simpler approach that this represents.
So John, talk a little bit about what you were doing with Claude also. So the Claude example is really fascinating, right? You can have it do some software development for you. I don't know if it's like full software development, but it does do some coding.
It's getting close, right?
Uh,
And I think it's actually such a great example of that principle number 4, which is assume that whatever it is you've got is the worst version you'll ever use. Because, literally before this newest version of Claude was released, it couldn't do a tenth of the things that this newest version can do as it pertains to software programming. I'll sort of share this in a very simple way. So I was sort of trying to figure out how easy it would be to write some very simple programs, some very simple scripts to do some automation on some data that I was working on. And I've actually used the same approach with ChatGPT before and an older version of Claude. And for somebody like me who's fairly technically minded but hasn't been programming in 20 years, it actually did allow me to become competent enough to write some of these things pretty effectively. And, including like, hey, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. Please walk me through that step by step. It's able to do that. Like this is, we've talked about the learning and education kind of benefits of these tools. What has changed in this most recent version of Claude, and I think is happening elsewhere too, is really two things. The first one is it has actually an integrated engine that actually allows you to run the code inside of Claude. So not only is it giving you the code and building it out sort of before your eyes, but it actually in a separate panel will run it and run the output of it. So you can actually be interacting directly with the program that you're writing and see in real time what the implications are of the changes that you asked Claude to make. So that's pretty amazing all by itself. Prior to this, you actually had to have your own development environment. You copy paste into that, you then run that code and see what happens, and then paste the results back into Claude and say, hey, I got this error, what's up? So now that loop is closed and Claude can do a lot of that iteration all on its own, which is pretty crazy. The second thing that's subtle, but I think probably more important, is that it demonstrates the ability to think and act like a programmer actually would in terms of doing some basics around keeping track of what the code is doing and sort of preparing it to be iterated on. And here's what I mean by that. So even a modestly competent programmer will comment their code so that you can see where the various elements and functions are and what they do. They will also do things like include a logging function that writes back to a file. Here's all the things that this program did. So like the one I built, the script was to go line by line through data and make some transformations based on what it found. So a log of that might say, line 1, complete successful, line 2, complete successful, line 3, error. Here's what the error was. That's something that even a beginner programmer is likely to do. And then the last one is to provide a simple interface, especially with these sort of working prototype that you're trying to build, a simple interface that allows somebody to input information to the program and then get feedback on the progress that's happening. Well, Claude does all that now on the programming side without even having to ask it. So I asked this simple set of things about this data file. It wrote it, and when it ran it, I saw a progress bar. I saw all the errors come up, and I saw it then go back and look into the log and say, here's where the errors are. Do you want to try to fix the code so this doesn't happen anymore? And that is just, it's really, really crazy.
It's very cool. It's so sophisticated now. I had a similar experiment with Claude this week. It was doing something pretty simple, but we're launching some new products. And as part of this, I was creating some sales tools that are going to help our sales team sell those solutions better. And in sales, having an ROI calculator is very handy to be able to show a client how this is going to benefit them and how quickly they're going to generate ROI. So instead of creating this spreadsheet around this, I went to Claude and asked it to create a calculator for me. It's an ROI calculator. I gave it the inputs of what we're looking for. And just like you said, it created one version of it. I said, make these changes. It made those changes. And in a half hour, I had a really great calculator that's going to be amazing for our sales team to be able to use. And that kind of thing is such a superpower for any business to be able to utilize to get their message across, have a tool created for them in a very short period of time just by talking to it like it's your assistant.
I wonder though, you, John, and you, Andy, sit in these places where you have the capacity, knowledge, and understanding to sort of pursue these things. As it goes sort of mainstream and widespread and down to the local business. I mean, I don't know where how that's going to work. And I think
Yeah.
there's got to be a huge amount of education. And it goes back to the first principle that you talked about, John, which is people just need to try to do things in this thing and then they'll think about something else. Try it. Our data says a lot of these small businesses are already starting to use this stuff. And, what is it, 40%, upwards of 40%, Greg, are using some tool.
Yeah, it's about 40% of small businesses now, or very close to that, have adopted AI in some capacity.
And I just think, what I don't hear out there in the market are sort of use cases, try this, educating. I don't see any of that, at least where I wander. And I think that's going to be a really big piece of this being as successful and delivering as much value as it potentially can.
100%.
Originally, I don't know what ChatGPT calls it now. And I don't know how active it is, but there was the GPT store or whatever you could build your own GPT. People could share GPTs. You could look through GPTs that third parties had created. It was this idea that there was going to be this app store built on top of ChatGPT, LLMs, and, you could find things that were point solutions and so on and so forth. And that really hasn't happened. I mean, there were a bunch of things that rolled out. Many of them were just not particularly useful, or they were self-promotional. And I think the vision for that didn't really materialize. Now, I could imagine something like that addressing, bridging the gap between what you're describing and what Neil's talking about, which is I, as a business owner, am not necessarily going to run a script or do my own coding, but I might search for something which represents a point solution or an application that will address my particular problem, right? That some independent developer might have generated, like, you, Andy, could hypothetically upload something to a store like that. It's logical that something like that would emerge, but it hasn't really yet.
Yeah. Here's another way to think about this is sort of like a law of small numbers kind of a view on this, and in terms of, we can't really see it. How could this possibly make a difference? And yet it really might. I just ChatGPT'd this. So the percentage of the entire US workforce that is in the programming field, that's programmers, is 0.1%. So very, very small number, 1 in 1,000 is a programmer. Now, if you were to assume that, people like Andy and I, who've got like enough technical thinking and experience in our paths with sort of how programming works generally, but haven't kept up with it. Like, let's say that we're in the 1%, like that there's only 1% of the total workforce. That, I'm not saying we're that rare or special, but let's just say that it's that number. Well, by getting these tools in our hands and people like us, we're now 10xing the total population of people that can do some form of programming in the workforce as a result of these tools. And I suspect the numbers are much more substantial than that. Now, you could argue, okay, Andy and I aren't going to actually have the throughput of a, programmer who's spending, 40 or 50 hours a week just programming. And that's for sure true. But, that's the kind of leverage that I think is possible here. I actually think it might be 5% or 10% of the total workforce that has enough programming in their background and systems understanding to pull that off. And then we're talking about 100-fold increase in programming throughput.
Well, interestingly, Google said in their earnings call this week that 25% of their code is now being written by Gemini, presumably,
Wow.
with humans doing some sort of overview, supervision, kind of editorial oversight, and then accepting the code. But that's pretty remarkable.
The P&L math that delivers, I mean, that's massive, straight to the bottom line.
And principle number 4, corollary, we should assume that that's the lowest percentage of code written by AI that it will ever be again, right? It'll be more than that next year and the year after.
And how long before it becomes more than 50%? Programming becomes a very different kind of job from writing code to, some sort of editorial oversight or technical oversight of the code that's being generated by the machine.
Yeah, and in the programming parlance, that's going to be the product side more than the programming side. So it's like, I have a vision for a product that does something specifically, and here's what it does specifically. And now I don't have to do the engineering or programming side of that. And, then you ask the question, well, at what point does AI start, encroaching on the product design and management side of things? And, then one click higher than that on the business side, making a business determination of what product to build and, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Neil, I thought your point was really interesting about how small businesses will start to adopt this. My feeling is that it's going to start with small incremental point solutions like what we're talking about, right? So for example, using some pre-made application where I can schedule more sales appointments is just a chatbot that I can use in my texts, right? Just normal I use text every day. So something that's going to go in the path of your daily life and your daily user experience and just make it super easy to weave that right in and integrate it in. And now you're using AI. And the benefit of that is, look at that, I'm scheduling more sales appointments. That's one example of many, but there's so many different kinds of automations. And I think the big backdrop behind a lot of this AI, when you think about it from a practical standpoint, is really around automation and in the business world, how do people buy their time back on the one hand? That's sort of like a defensive kind of play of how do I do that? And then there's an offensive play around how do I create better customer experiences? And what is that like? And I think that when you check the box both on defensive and offensive, that's when you have a solution that is
really matters.
Must have kind of AI tools or use cases to be able to adopt in your workflow.
I want to push back on something you said, Andy, about the point solutions being the sort of the entry point for a lot of small business customers. I think that may be a parallel entry point, but what we've seen in our surveys and conversations is that these guys are all using ChatGPT, and they're starting with marketing, but many of them have moved on to some sort of customer experience, customer service dimension. Some of them are using it for competitive intelligence. Some of them are using it for ideation and product development. I mean, overwhelmingly, marketing is the entry point for most of these business owners, but they're doing other things too that they're largely discovering on their own, or maybe they're having some conversation with a friend or a colleague who's saying, hey, you can do this kind of thing with it, and it really works well. I think there's an appetite for point solutions that can do specific business tasks, and we'll talk about Notebook LM as a CRM substitute. They have needs. We've identified a bunch of needs that they have. Beyond customer acquisition, they've got a whole bunch of needs, and those are product development opportunities for somebody to build some useful, easy, inexpensive thing that will address, whatever it is, some sort of customer analytics, CRM-y kind of thing, whatever.
Well, you're describing exactly what we're building, so thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm validating you.
So, but what all my point is that the entry point is just like whether it's ChatGPT or whatever it is, it's a simple entry point, a simple use case that somebody who hasn't used AI before is going to not just use it once and say, oh, that didn't work for me, I'm not using AI. It's something that becomes useful for them. And it's like, there's life before that, and then there's life after that. And when you find that use case, it's probably a simple use case. It's probably something simple that whether they're using ChatGPT in that way, and then they go, hey, wait a second, this is an iceberg, and I'm just at the tip of the iceberg on this thing.
Yep.
And then they start to unravel it and start to use it a lot more. That's this whole discovery process. But I do think it's something simple that will be.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Search GPT. And ChatGPT. The thing that propelled Google was the simplicity of the interface, right? You could just enter anything into the search box and get information back. And ChatGPT and Claude and Perplexity to varying degrees are the same principle. It's a very simple UI. You can ask questions, you can input information, and you get stuff back, and it reinforces your usage. It's pretty intuitive. Your engagement with it is reinforced by success. The more success you have, the more things you discover, the more of the iceberg you discover. And just real quickly on this week, SearchGPT launched as part of ChatGPT for paid users. Ultimately, it'll come to the free product. SearchGPT was a standalone beta, and they said, we're going to fold it into ChatGPT by the end of the year. Now they have. And it's really pretty good. It's something that makes ChatGPT better. And SearchGPT, which was previously on its own, is made better by ChatGPT. So they're integrated. There's some quirks. It's still very early days, but it's really pretty good. And you could do a lot with it. And you've got the entirety of ChatGPT behind it. So it's not like people are going to search for things and say, this isn't what I expected, or Google is much better, and abandon ChatGPT. They're going to keep using ChatGPT, and the search component of it will continue to improve, and the data will get richer. And so it really is a bona fide Google challenger, I think.
Have you compared it with Perplexity?
I haven't done a head-to-head comparison with it. I mean, Perplexity is great, and I use Perplexity a lot, but it's a slightly different animal. Perplexity has got ChatGPT capabilities, but it's much more like an AI search alternative, the way that they positioned it.
Yeah.
It's like when you're searching for discrete information, Perplexity can give that to you, but it can also do other things like summarize articles and query refinements and things like that. Contextually.
I had one great experience yesterday using Search and ChatGPT, and one terrible experience. And one was almost perfect results, and one was completely useless results. So, I mean, people are going to have to get used to that and be okay with that.
John or Andy, you can speak to this technically. I mean, one of the things about these LLMs is that there's a certain amount of unpredictability, variability. It's not as tied down as Google has historically been, right? Where you put in a query, you get a certain rank of results that can be pretty consistent time over time. There's a certain amount of mutation, let's call it, that comes into this. So you can put the same query in to ChatGPT multiple times, and you might get slightly different answers. I was doing a lot of local lookups, a lot of small business, a lot of, best pizza, places to stay in New York, et cetera, handyman, HVAC. And it was very interesting. I mean, I didn't do these searches repeatedly to see if the results were consistent, but it was pretty interesting. Mostly pretty good, some better than others, but certainly viable.
It reminds me back in the day, in the early days of the internet with search engines. I used to work at InfoSeek and back in the time, and we would have these competitions between InfoSeek and Excite and AltaVista and Yahoo. And all of the leaders of those teams would get together, and it was like a hackathon for search, right? And so there would be somebody who would moderate it, and they would say something to the effect of, okay, find me this piece of information in your search engine. Ready? Go. And whoever found it first, would get points, and then the other teams would have to buy beers and pizza and whatever. So it was a lot of fun doing that with our competition in the market. But it reminds me of that because it was hard to find all that information back then, right? You'd have to refine your search, and you'd have to try again. And, meanwhile, the clock's ticking. You're like, okay, I got to find this answer. Same kind of thing here is that you might not get the full answer that you're looking for, so you have to iterate and refine it. The difference here is that it's just so much more advanced. It's not even comparable.
And refinement is really easy. I mean, one of the great things about ChatGPT or a LLM scenario is that it understands context. And so you can establish certain things that, hey, this is who I am. This is what I'm looking for at the beginning. I've got a project. These are the elements. And then you could just go and go and go and go, and it knows the context. Google is working toward that. But every search that you do on Google is a discrete search. And it doesn't have that, there may be some limited context around location or something, but you don't have to give ChatGPT the full explanation again. You can say, what about the next one? Or I was looking for something, show me the reviews or whatever. And it knows, it's like talking to a person. It knows what's come before.
Imagine the 3 contestants on Chopped being given a set of food items, and then each one gets to use a different AI tool to figure out what they're going to make. Now that would be bringing like this stuff into what people watch all the time. I think that'd be
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Hopefully nobody ends up with pizza with Elmer's glue on it. That would be.
Yeah.
We don't want that. No.
I think there's going to be some TV show that's going to leverage this stuff. It's going to happen.
I would also just interject a little nerdy tech bit here in case anybody is interested in this. So what you're describing, Greg, in terms of, the slight differences that you get every time you ask ChatGPT versus you always get the same answer in Google. In general, that's deterministic versus probabilistic is what it's called. So deterministic being I put in something and the machine grinds, and when it grinds, it always creates the same determined answer, right? The algorithm outputs based on the input, and there's not really a lot of change there. Probabilistic is the approach that the neural nets and ChatGPT and LLMs use, which is it's predicting the next likely word, given the context, given the question, all that kind of stuff. And then the reason that there's that little bit of random or that change from answer to answer is they actually intentionally insert a little bit of randomness into every single answer. So they're tweaking and, just changing the environment just a little bit, which is what, ends up giving you a slightly different answer every time.
And they do that because?
Well, so for two reasons. One of them is if you don't do that at all, you actually end up getting a very flat sort of tonality in every answer. It's sort of robotic. This goes to what's called the temperature of a response in an LLM. If it's too far one direction, it's so flowery and crazy that it's hard to. It looks like it was written by a sixth grader with a thesaurus, crazy word choice. Like you can follow it, but it's word salad. And then the other end of the spectrum, when you really sort of ratchet it down, it's monotone. So one of the reasons is to create that randomness where you get a little bit more sort of tonality in it. And I think that the other reason is that if you're actually asking the same questions, you're benefited by getting slightly different answers if the same question keeps coming up. So, ideally, I think the way it's tweaked and tuned, that the randomness that gets injected doesn't say, oh, I'm going to just totally change everything about this answer, but it's just enough to tweak it so that you don't get the exact same paragraph being spit out every time.
And there are probably use cases that are more well suited to that approach and ones that are not as good, right?
Yeah, and this is where hallucinations crop up, because if you take a purely probabilistic approach on this stuff, you can calculate the probability of, answering a question about why are there only 20 unicorns in the United States, how that should unfold, and get a totally wrong answer, even though probabilistically it's the right answer.
Google, is seeing competition from various players now. It feels like the market is now in flux a little bit, where it wasn't for a long time, the search market. However, Google reported Q3 results and they had a great quarter, seemingly no impact from any direction on their earnings, search usage. I mean, they're saying the most positive things they can, obviously, but there doesn't seem to be any impact thus far from ChatGPT, from Perplexity on Google, although ChatGPT now has 250 million weekly users, up from 200 million just a couple of months ago. And there was recently a survey that said half at least of the respondents were using ChatGPT on a weekly basis versus, 97% that were using Google. So there's definitely growth happening. And at some point that should have an impact. We have a survey coming out that really seeks to ascertain how people are thinking about search versus AI, and we'll present the results of that, in coming episodes. And it should be really interesting because we're asking all these questions very directly. Whereas are people using ChatGPT and Perplexity and these other tools, Claude, Copilot, in conjunction with search, or are they changing how they use search, or are they using search less? That's what we're trying to figure out. And I think that'll evolve for sure, but we're trying to take a picture in time of how people are thinking right now about these things in relation to one another.
This is how the singularity begins, because I think what happens is that you start using it more and more, right? It becomes more active, and you got, oh, I got a question, or somebody asks you something. I don't know, let's ask Google. And I see this in my own personal life more and more, and I'm certainly doing it a lot more, just by asking questions that I probably wouldn't have used it in this way or used Google in this way previously. And that experience alone, once you have quick answers and you can get those quick answers, at some point it'll be some kind of hardware device that you'll, really have as your phone.
Last night, I was with my wife at dinner, and her sister, she has a younger sister who is going to Europe with her new husband, and they're spending time in Scotland, London, and Dublin. And the question was, what's the best way to get from Aberdeen to London? The short version of the discussion is that I went to ChatGPT, not Google, went to ChatGPT and said, what's the fastest train between Aberdeen and London? How much travel time? Now, Google might have answered that in a featured snippet at the top of the page, but just the ability to get quick information, as you're saying, to put in a question, get very quick information back, makes that the superior choice in my mind versus sort of clicking through to websites. No, that's not the right one. Click, no, that's not the right one. Google's trying to circumvent that by putting AI overviews at the top of the page or using featured snippets, but it's an inferior experience, at least today, to what I was able to do just by asking some quick questions. Now, that didn't get me to the train ticket, but I feel like ChatGPT is a more expansive tool than Google is at this point.
It's also an end-to-end response that you get, right? So you don't have to click on a link and then go to somebody else's website that isn't Google that then has pop-up video reel that slides in. You're like, all I want is the answer to my question. I don't need all this other stuff. And in an AI environment, whether it's ChatGPT or other, you're going to just get that response. They control that end-to-end experience, which creates this behavior modification kind of loop where you then get your response. You're like, hey, this is reliable, actually. I'm getting what I want. I'm going to start using it more. And I think that's what's theoretically, I don't know, but it seems to me that this would drive the size of the pie to be bigger in terms of usage.
Well, luckily, we're going to survey 1,000 U.S. consumers who don't sit and think about this stuff all day long.
By the way, it would be, you're probably going to be doing this, but if the pie is getting bigger, that means they're taking hours from somewhere else. And it would be interesting to know what that somewhere else is. Maybe it's our 7 hours a day TV, diet that we're on in the US, but that would be a fascinating, bit of data out of this survey.
Yeah, what we don't have is an estimate of how much time on a daily basis they're using these tools. We have the frequency, daily, weekly, monthly, or multiple times a day, but we don't have a sense of estimate how much time you're spending on ChatGPT.
I think that'd be very hard for people to.
Well, they would give you an estimate. You'd give them a range and they'd give you an estimate, and it wouldn't be accurate, but it would be directionally accurate, right? They could sort of say, I'm spending a couple hours a day, or I'm spending an hour a day or less than an hour a day. I think that would be sort of interesting to see. People's memories are unreliable, but in the aggregate, you kind of get a sense of what people are doing, even with the.
And aren't those minutes also concentrated minutes? Because you just use it for a short period of time. You need to get your answer, right? So as opposed to an inferior experience where you have to do a search, then you click on somebody's website. No, that's not it. You got to go back. No, that's not it. And then you redo a search. That's obviously takes a lot longer than, going to ChatGPT. So it feels like the AI minutes that you spend are
more efficient.
Yeah, they're not 1-to-1 minutes, it seems.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
So fewer minutes, better results.
Right.
Well, efficiency is one of the top 3 benefits that people cite consistently about using AI. Should we talk about Notebook LM?
Yeah, I was going to segue there. So fire away.
Yeah, so, Notebook LM is this Google product. We've talked about it a whole bunch on this podcast. It started out as a kind of educational tool, a way to kind of catalog information and then query that information, and as a research aid, for students, maybe for professional researchers. And it's really evolving very quickly into something else, which is fascinating. And that really took flight when Google introduced the podcast feature, or deep dive conversations, as they call it, where you could turn any material, an insurance contract, a slide deck, a text of an article into a discussion between two voices, a male and a female voice. And that just captivated people and it went viral. And now Notebook LM is one of Google's highest profile AI products. And they're starting to evolve it in an interesting direction. They're developing a business version of it. And there was an article that Neil showed me this week about, raising the question of whether or not this is a substitute for CRM applications, which is really fascinating.
And most people don't like CRM solutions. Most users don't like to use it. They're forced to by companies. They're kludgy. They're hard to figure out. If you worked on one at one company and you went to another company, now you got to learn another one.
Yeah.
And the ability to just sort of throw your emails into this thing and ask it to kind of build something that is like a CRM is pretty fascinating.
Maybe you guys could sort of describe what it would even mean for Notebook LM to replace a CRM. That might, I'd be interested in what your take is on that.
Well, I mean, it's something that Andy alluded to earlier with putting all this material, client material, customer material into Notebook LM. And the way that Notebook LM works, for those people who are unfamiliar with it, which is probably not too many people these days, is that you upload documents. It can be cut and paste text. It can be PDFs. It can be PowerPoints, Word documents.
All your emails.
If you take your email, take your MBX file, you upload that to Notebook LM, it takes all that data, it structures it. Oh, this is somebody's first name, their last name, their email address, all that stuff, parses it, puts it into the CRM, then takes all of the context from those conversations, also loads them in, and then it becomes this queryable AI. You can create a workflow for it so that automatically it will present to you the next morning, hey, it looks like you should reach out to Neil. It's been a while, or, last time you spoke to Greg was 2 weeks ago. He was going on vacation. You want me to ask him how his vacation was? And, these kinds of things, and have it prompt you with a bunch of tasks. Instead of you inputting the tasks, you can certainly input the tasks in this kind of environment, this like make-believe AI kind of Notebook LM CRM. You could do that. And this is the idea, is that this is where all this technology will go, is that if you have an idea, if you have a task, you can say to it, don't forget to call John in 2 days or whatever. It can give you those kinds of tasks and remind you of doing those things, and even make it so that it is just seamless on your phone, so that it just pops up, call John. Okay, you press a button. Now I'm talking to John. Great, right? So number of these things that are usually manually driven, salespeople hate it. If that tool can now prompt you with, it's time to reach out to this person. I already drafted up an email. What do you think? That's a game changer. That's a big deal.
Well, and Notebook LM, just as an example of something larger, is not really set up to be a CRM. I mean, you could use it informally for that, but this is where the point solution discussion comes back in, is that complex processes that characterize some of these SaaS programs of the past.
The amount of energy and time that goes into it, the organizations of all scale, like trying to capture that information. I mean, how many sales meetings, Andy, have you and I been in together where it's like, did you guys update the CRM? Like, okay, everybody stop what you're doing for the next 30 minutes. We're going to add all this stuff. Like, it's the bane of every sales manager's existence and most salespeople's existence as well. So even if it could take some of that friction out, that would be pretty game changing.
Well, now that we've talked about our whole platform that we're building here, we'll announce this soon. But we're heading in that direction. Very funny. It's actually right on point with where we're heading. All right, guys. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much for a really interesting conversation, as always. It was good to see you all, and we'll pick it up next episode. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Thanks, guys.